e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, castle kingside, bishop e7, knight c3, d6, d3, castle kingside, bishop takes c6, b takes c6, d4, knight d7, d takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, queen h5, f5, queen e2, queen d6, f4, f takes e4, knight takes e4, queen d4 check, knight f2, bishop c5, c3, queen d5, b4, bishop a7, bishop e3, bishop takes e3, queen takes e3, e takes f4, queen e7, bishop f5, rook a e1, a5, rook e5, queen d6, b takes a5, queen takes e7, rook takes, rook takes c7, rook f6, rook a1, rook a3, rook e1, rook takes a2, rook e8 check, rook f8, rook e1, rook b8, h3, rook c2, rook e7, bishop g6, rook takes g7 check, king h8, rook g e7, rook c1 check, king h2, rook c2, king g1, king g8, h4, rook takes c3, knight g4, king f8, h5, rook b1 check, king h2, rook c5, knight f6, rook c1, king h3, rook c3 check, king g4, rook f1, knight takes h7 check, bishop takes, rook takes h7, rook g3 check, king f5, king g8, rook h d7, king h8, rook d8 check, rook g8, rook d6, rook g7, rook c8 check, king h7, rook d8, rook f7 check, king g5, rook e7, king f6, rook e6 check, king takes e6, rook e1 check, king f6, rook e6 check, king takes e6, king h6, king f6, king takes h5, rook h8 check, king g4, rook c g8 checkmate.